His name is known across the world. Aristotle, philosopher, scholar, mentor of kings. A man who, for the first time in history, dared to comprehend and describe the entirety of existence, from the motion of stars to the secrets of the sea, from the laws of logic to the order of states. His works became the bedrock of science, philosophy, and education for millennia. This is not simply a chronicle of his life. This is the story of the mind that taught humanity how to think. Suggest in the comments topics for new stories and subscribe to the channel. New bedtime stories come out here every day. Now, let us return to the beginning, to a coastal town where destiny quietly stirred. In the early years of the 1st century before our era, on the peninsula of Chalkidiki, a small city named Stagira cradled the birth of a child who would one day alter the course of human thought. No one in its bustling streets could foresee it then. The fishermen pulling their nets, the merchants calling out beneath the sun, the artisans hammering metal and carving wood, the philosophers debating in shaded porticos, all were witnesses to the first cries of the boy named Aristotle. Stagira was not a grand city, but it was alive. Its harbour embraced ships from across the Aegean. Voices mingled, the rough tones of sailors, the chants of traders, the laughter of children, the steady arguments of men in search of truth. Among them lived a family of dignity and respect. Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, was not merely a physician. He was the personal doctor to the Macedonian king Amyntas II, grandfather of the future Alexander the Great. Nicomachus descended from a lineage of healers who traced their roots to Asclepius, the god of medicine. For generations they had preserved knowledge of herbs, anatomy and remedies, not through superstition alone, but through careful observation, method and reason. Their wisdom was not whispered incantations, but the measured weighing of evidence, the rhythm of pulse, the hue of skin, the breath of life itself. Their home stood apart from the crowded square nearer the sea. Within its walls, jars of tinctures breathed their sharp scents. Scrolls, still damp from ink, lined the shelves. Metal instruments glistened in the soft light, beside clay vessels filled with bitter concoctions. For a young boy, this was no ordinary household. It was a sanctuary of knowledge, a laboratory where mysteries unfolded. From his earliest years, Aristotle watched his father work. Patients came through their doors in quiet desperation, men trembling with fever, farmers with broken bones, women pale from illnesses unnamed. Nicomachus leaned close, listening to lungs, counting the throb of arteries, watching the flicker of the patient's eyes. He sought patterns in symptoms, threads of logic hidden in the body's chaos, and Aristotle, small, curious, attentive, absorbed everything. For him, it was not spectacle, not merely the drama of sickness and healing. It was gateway. Each gesture, each question, each remedy became part of his own unfolding world. He was beginning to sense it. Behind the disorder of life, behind the diversity of appearances, there were laws, reasons, causes. The boy's world expanded with every breath his father took at a patient's side. Aristotle watched as Nicomachus pressed his palm gently on an abdomen, listened to the whisper of breath, measured the rhythm of the pulse, studied the shade of skin, the brightness or dullness in a pair of eyes. His father was not searching for miracles, he was searching for patterns. Behind each symptom, a hidden order waited to be revealed. Nicomachus believed that health was more than flesh and bone. It was the balance of body and mind, the influence of climate, the nourishment of food, the weight of mood, the harmony between human beings and their environment. To a child, these lessons were more than knowledge. They were revelations. They whispered that nature was not chaos, that every phenomenon, no matter how strange, carried a reason beneath its surface. Often Nicomachus took his son with him on his rounds. Together they visited farmers in distant villages, fishermen by the restless sea, wealthy citizens in their marble homes. The boy observed, wide-eyed. He saw fevers rise from the damp air of valleys. He learned how the crisp winds of highlands brought cleaner breaths. He noticed that sailors bore different afflictions than farmers, that the sea shaped the body as surely as the land. These fragments wove themselves into a single vision. Humanity was bound to the world that cradled it. But fortune is fragile, and the golden thread of childhood soon unravelled. When Aristotle was around 10 years old, death entered his home. His father, Nicomachus, fell ill, or perhaps it was an accident. History kept the cause hidden. What remained was absence. Soon after, his mother, Phaestius, also passed away. A silence heavier than stone descended. The boy, once sheltered by wisdom and care, was now an orphan. Guardianship fell to Proxenus of Atarneus, a kinsman across the sea in Asia Minor. He was not merely a caretaker, but a man of learning, versed in philosophy, mathematics, poetry, and the art of rhetoric. He chose not to raise the boy with shelter alone, but with knowledge. Under Proxenus, mornings began with verses of Homer committed to memory. Geometry followed, lines and shapes unfolding like a secret language of the cosmos. Arithmetic sharpened the mind. Rhetoric taught the shaping of words, while myths and stories painted the wide horizon of human imagination. More than recitations, there was inquiry. Proxenus encouraged curiosity, urged the boy to reason, to connect fact with fact, to build conclusions like a craftsman assembling stone. But above all, he taught him to look at nature. They wandered groves and springs, the shore where waves kissed the rocks. Together they asked questions of the world. Why do certain trees cling to dry slopes while others thirst for water's edge? Why do some birds wear long slender beaks while others bear short and powerful ones? Why do animals shift their patterns as storms draw near? Aristotle was learning a new way of seeing. Most people accepted the world at face value. He did not. He always asked, why? Why does the sun rise in the east? Why do some flowers bloom in spring and others in summer? Why does iron sink, but wood floats? Why are some men healthy, while others are always sick? His questions multiplied like stars, and in those questions a destiny was taking shape. He thought he was chasing answers. In truth, he was learning how to ask the questions that would outlive him. From an early age, Aristotle stood apart from other children. His curiosity was matched by something rarer still, an instinct for order. He was not content to gather fragments of knowledge. He wanted to bind them together, to see how one truth leaned upon another, how causes and effects were woven into the fabric of reality. When he heard tales from fishermen, it was never enough to know how fish were caught. He wondered why fish swam in certain waters, what governed their abundance, how the pull of the moon and the rhythm of tides ruled their movements. When he watched a blacksmith at his forge, the spectacle of sparks and flame did not satisfy him. He questioned why one metal softened faster than another, how fire transformed ore into pliant strength, and what invisible laws commanded matter's change. By the time he reached his 15th year, It was plain to all that Stagira was too small for such a mind. The lanes of his native town, the harbour filled with sails, the markets and the chatter, they could not contain his horizon. Proxenus, wise enough to see it, understood that the boy needed a master greater than himself, and so he made a decision that would shape history. Aristotle must go to Athens. Athens, the beating heart of the Greek world, where thought itself seemed to walk the streets. At 17, the boy from Stagira crossed its threshold. What unfolded before him was not a city of towering palaces or daunting fortresses, but a city built upon dialogue. Here glory did not rest in monuments of stone, but in the freedom of the word. In shaded porticos and bustling gymnasia, clusters of men spoke endlessly of the nature of the world, the structure of the polis, the pursuit of virtue, the mysteries of the cosmos. Voices collided and intertwined, ethics with politics, astronomy with poetry, law with the meaning of life itself. Yet for Aristotle, Athens was not merely a destination, it was a gateway. Beyond the northwest gate among sacred groves lay the place he sought above all others, the Academy. Founded by Plato only 2 decades earlier, the Academy had no equal in all of Greece. It was not a private tutor's chamber, not a casual circle of thinkers, but the first true institution of learning, systematic, continuous, alive with lectures, disputations, a garden for contemplation, and a library for the preservation of thought. When Aristotle first stepped through its gates, Plato was 60 years old, a figure already half legend, pupil of Socrates, father of the theory of forms, and author of dialogues that would echo through centuries as works of art and philosophy. The boy from Stagira was about to meet the master of Athens, and in that meeting a new path of thought would begin to unfold. At the Academy, every word was weighed, every claim examined, every assumption gently broken open to see what lay inside. It began at dawn. Students gathered beneath the pale leaves of olives and the pale columns of porticos, their breath a faint mist in the morning cool. They listened to Plato, or to the trusted circle who spoke in his name. The air smelled of early figs, damp earth and ink. Styluses moved across wax tablets. Minds woke. The subjects spiralled from the highest to the most practical. The nature of being, the motion of the heavens, the virtues of the citizen, the shape of an ideal state. Between lectures they walked, the peripatetic rhythm that made thinking a movement. In those long circuits through the groves, students tested arguments the way a jeweller tests a stone, turning them, tapping them, seeking the hairline fractures of contradiction. They framed syllogisms, overturned them, refined them, then built them anew. Evening brought another assembly where doubts were named and the next day's questions prepared. Aristotle entered this world like a swimmer into bright water. The theory of forms dazzled him at first, its audacity, its severe beauty. According to Plato, beyond the flux of this visible world stood a higher reality, eternal, unchanging, the realm of ideas or forms. Everything seen here, the lovely vase, the just action, the accurate circle, was only a shadow, an imperfect copy of a perfect original that existed beyond sight. Objects borrowed their beauty from the idea of beauty, their justice from the idea of justice, their shape from the idea of circle. It was a vision both intoxicating and exacting, and Aristotle studied it with devotion. He ranged across the Academy's disciplines with a calm hunger, philosophy and logic, geometry and mathematics, astronomy and ethics. Above all, he learned the discipline that bound them, dialectic, the art of asking, answering, revealing contradiction and inching toward clarity. Truth, he discovered here, did not arrive as a single thunderbolt. It advanced by a quieter law: question, objection, refinement, a triad repeated like the beat of a heart. Yet as his understanding deepened, so did the shadows at its edges. Small questions, almost delicate at first, began to press upon the mind that loved concrete things. How, precisely, did the idea touch the object? If beauty existed apart, why was it never found except in beautiful things? Where did justice live? In the law, in the deed, in the mind, or somewhere always elsewhere? Such thoughts flickered and would not go out. If the forms were entirely separate, what bridged the distance between the eternal and the perishable? By what real connection did the unchanging give order to what always changes? And if the explanation of a thing rested outside the thing, if its being was explained by a form beyond the world, did philosophy risk abandoning the very reality it sought to understand? In the cloistered light of the academy, this was a dangerous tenderness, a love for particulars. Aristotle found himself drawn to the stubborn fact: this bird, this branch, this breath. He did not reject the radiance of the forms, he questioned their reach. Perhaps the essence of a thing was not exiled to a separate realm. Perhaps its form lived within it, as structure, as nature, as what made it this and not something else. The groves heard his uncertainties. He voiced them without malice, testing Plato's architecture the way an engineer tests a bridge, not to destroy, but to know the weight it could carry. The more he reasoned, the more he felt it, the pull from vision to observation, from the sky of ideas to the ground of experience. There was a turn taking place, almost imperceptible, like a vessel adjusting its rudder by a single finger's pressure, a shift from the map to the landscape, from the diagram to the leaf, from the perfect to the real. He would keep walking those shaded paths. He would keep asking, but his gaze had changed direction. He began to wonder whether truth to be true must also be near. And from that nearness another conviction took root. Aristotle came more and more to believe that essence was not exiled to some distant realm. It was not suspended in invisible space beyond the senses. It lived within the thing itself, its shape, its nature, its form. He did not keep these thoughts silent. With the same calm persistence he had shown as a child, he carried them into the open air of the Academy's disputations. He was unafraid to challenge not only fellow students but Plato himself. His arguments were not reckless assaults. They were the careful chiselling of a sculptor, chipping away at marble to reveal what lay within. If there exists an idea of motion, he would ask, why is motion never seen except in moving bodies? And if there is an idea of justice, where does it dwell? In the deeds of men, in the laws they write, in the conscience of the heart, or in some unseen place that can never be touched? Such questions made him both admired and unsettling. To many he was the indispensable voice of honest inquiry. To others he was a thorn in the side of harmony. Plato himself, according to whispers that survived the centuries, both respected and lamented him. He is said to have remarked, "Aristotle is a child kicking against his mother." The metaphor carried both affection and a trace of sorrow. Yet even in such words Plato revealed his esteem, for he saw in his students' defiance not rebellion for its own sake, but the restless hunger for truth. The difference was clear. While the Academy lingered on abstractions, Aristotle's eyes turned insistently to the tangible, to leaves and feathers, to the curve of shells, to the structures of living flesh. He studied the rise of plants from soil, the growth of animals, the subtle laws of their form, details that others dismissed as trivial. He gathered them, recorded them, pondered them. In fish he noted the variations of gills, in mollusks the asymmetry of bodies, in birds the way climate shaped habits and instincts. What others considered distractions from philosophy, he began to shape into philosophy's new foundation: observation, classification, conclusion drawn from experience. The seeds of a method that would outlive empires were already sprouting in the notebooks of a young man. Still, despite his growing divergence from the Platonic school, Aristotle did not leave. Nearly 20 years he remained, learning, teaching, debating. He guided younger students, dissected texts with them, trained them in the art of reasoning, moderated disputes. Slowly he took his place not only as a pupil, but as a teacher. Already he was writing works of his own. Most would not survive the passage of time. Yet the act itself was a foreshadowing. His mind was not content to inherit, it had begun to create. But even as his authority grew, the Academy faced a question of its own. Plato was nearing 80. The matter of succession could no longer be ignored. Whispers filled the porticos, names floated in the air. Despite Aristotle's brilliance, the choice fell elsewhere, and with that decision, the next turn in his path drew near. Perhaps the cause was simple. His thought had wandered too far from Plato's. Perhaps it was politics, the rivalries of men, or the jealousies that haunt every circle of influence. Whatever the reason, when Plato died in 347 BCE, Aristotle's life entered a new chapter. It was the end of a long apprenticeship and the beginning of an uncharted journey, away from Athens, away from the Academy, into the wider world. The death of the master was not only the close of an epoch in Athenian philosophy, it was also a clock striking for Aristotle, marking a moment he could not ignore. Nearly 20 years he had walked those groves, but to remain was now impossible. First, the succession passed to Speusippus, Plato's own nephew, whose mind remained closer to the orthodox currents of the school. Second, in Athens, the air itself was changing. Anti-Macedonian sentiments grew sharp, casting suspicion on those with roots in allied or dependent cities, such as Aristotle of Stagira. And third, perhaps most decisive, his own philosophy had already diverged beyond reconciliation. The bridges to Plato's vision were not merely strained, they were broken. So he accepted with readiness an invitation from Hermias, ruler of the small city of Assos on the coast of Asia Minor near ancient Troas. Hermias was no ordinary sovereign. A philosopher by training, a pupil of Eudoxus, he carried in his heart the dream of blending rule with wisdom. His vision was to transform his city into a haven for scholars, a refuge where philosophy and inquiry could thrive. Here, Aristotle found a place that mirrored his own inner shift. No longer confined by endless debates over immaterial forms, he immersed himself in what called most urgently to him: the study of nature, the patterns of the world, the structures of living beings, the hidden chains of cause and effect. At Assos, alongside his colleague and friend Xenocrates, Aristotle founded a small philosophical school. It was no echo of the Academy. It was something different, a place where philosophy walked hand in hand with natural science, where observation was not beneath wisdom, but at its very core. They watched plants and animals, catalogued forms, traced patterns, and sought to turn the chaos of life into an intelligible order. Among the young minds drawn to this circle was a man named Theophrastus. Attentive, sharp, and restless, he would become Aristotle's closest disciple, inheritor of his school, and later the father of botany itself. In Assos, Aristotle was not merely a student or a challenger. He was a founder. He was building the foundations of his own legacy, stone by stone, thought by thought. And yet, even this new chapter was only a threshold. The first years in Assos became a season of restless discovery. Aristotle spent long hours on the shore, his gaze fixed not on distant skies but on the living tide before him. He watched the shimmer of scales, the slow movements of crabs, the sudden jet of a cephalopod vanishing into depth. Fishermen carried their catch ashore, and there he would sit beside them, recording, sketching, dissecting with patient care. He studied the gills of fish, noting how their forms shifted from species to species. He traced the strength of fins, the arrangement of organs in mollusks, the peculiarities of shellfish that seemed half symmetrical, half chaotic. What fascinated him was not just their appearance, but their purpose. Why some creatures thrived in the light of shallow waters, while others belonged to the dark of the deep. Why one form of body suited a quiet bay, while another was forged for open seas. His mind was not confined to biology alone. In the quiet hours after his observations, Aristotle's thought turned back to philosophy's oldest questions: causality, change, movement, essence, and form. Here, on the Anatolian coast, the outlines of one of his most enduring contributions began to take shape: the theory of four causes. To truly explain anything, he reasoned, four questions must be answered. What is it made of? The material cause. What is its shape, its structure? The formal cause. What force sets it into motion or brings it into being? The efficient cause, and for what purpose does it exist? The final cause. This quartet, simple yet profound, would become a cornerstone not only of his own system, but of European science and philosophy for centuries. But no season of peace is secure. After only a few years, Assos was shaken. Hermias, the patron who had sheltered philosophers with his vision of a learned city, fell victim to betrayal and conspiracy. He was killed, his state collapsing under the weight of intrigue. The school of Assos, so full of promise, was no more. Once again Aristotle was forced to move. His path led him across the waters to the island of Lesbos, to the city of Mytilene. Here, among the soft hills and bright waters of a sheltered gulf, he entered what might be called the most fruitful scientific period of his life. On Lesbos he looked again at the living world, but this time with sharper eyes and a new ambition: classification. For the first time, he began to group creatures by traits he deemed essential: those with blood, those without, those that breathed by lungs, by gills, or by other hidden means. The structures of limbs, the patterns of nourishment, the mysteries of reproduction, all became signs by which nature might be ordered. And here, on the shores of the Lesbos Strait, Aristotle practiced something unprecedented: the systematic comparison of life, step by step, with observation, description, and careful arrangement. He was laying the groundwork for what the world would one day call the empirical sciences. What others saw as a coastline, he saw as a library. Each creature was a page, each form a lesson, each question a key. Yet life on Lesbos was not built only of study and observation. In Mytilene, Aristotle wove his private life into the fabric of his work. He married Pythias, the niece of his late friend and patron Hermias. This union gave him not only companionship, but also deeper bonds with the circle that had sheltered and supported him in recent years. From this marriage was born a son, Nicomachus. Years later, Aristotle would inscribe his name in the title of one of his greatest works, the Nicomachean Ethics, a monument of reflection dedicated to the art of living well. But the philosopher's gaze reached beyond sea creatures and anatomy. In this period he meditated on humanity itself, on the role of community, on the fragile balance that made a state just, on the virtues that brought stability and prosperity, and on the vices that corroded order into ruin. These thoughts would flow into his political philosophy, into the pages of his treatise Politics, where the city would be examined as carefully as a living body. For a time, life on Lesbos seemed calm, but beyond the Aegean, storms gathered. Events in Macedonia soon pulled him into the heart of power. King Philip II was shaping his kingdom into a force to rival any in Greece. He dreamed of reforming his armies, expanding his dominion, and raising his son in the spirit of Hellenic culture and science. For this task, he summoned Aristotle. The invitation was more than an honour, it was a turning point. To accept meant to leave the quiet rhythms of natural study and enter the furnace where politics and destiny were forged. It meant binding his own life to the fate of a young prince, Alexander, who would one day stride into history as a conqueror. Aristotle was 41 years old when he received the summons. Behind him lay years of training at the academy, decades of disputation and study, patient research in Assos and Mytilene, hundreds of days spent recording the mysteries of nature and anatomy. Ahead of him lay a task unlike any he had faced, to shape not merely the mind of a student, but the mind of a ruler. Philip II knew well the man he was inviting. Their families had been linked for a generation. Aristotle's father had once served Philip's father, King Amyntas II, as court physician. These personal ties mattered, yet they were not enough on their own. What made the invitation irresistible was Aristotle's reputation. In all of Hellas he was recognized as a rare mind, one who united the love of reflection with a passion for observing the real. Philip understood that his son's inheritance would not be a throne alone. It would be wars, alliances, empires. Alexander would need to see not just the glory of command, but the structures of the world itself, the logic of states, the order of society, the nature of things. And who better to teach him than the man who sought truth in stars and shells alike, in law and in leaf, in speech and in silence. When Aristotle arrived in Macedonia, Alexander was 13 years old. Even at that tender age, the boy already bore the traits that would one day astonish both contemporaries and posterity. His mind was quick, his memory prodigious, his thirst for knowledge insatiable. He possessed a fierce determination, a confidence in his own destiny, an unshakable sense that he was marked for something beyond the ordinary. But alongside these gifts burned a volatile fire. He was impulsive, stubborn, prone to outbursts of pride. His brilliance carried with it a dangerous heat, and it required careful guidance to be shaped into strength rather than consumed in flame. For this reason, the air was removed from the noise of Pella's court. A special residence was chosen at Mieza, a serene retreat of hills as forests. Far from intrigue, far from the crowded life of the palace, Aristotle and his young pupil began their shared labour. Days filled with study, conversation, observation of nature, and long reflections on life, power, justice, and the design of the world. The programme Aristotle devised was nothing less than a mirror of all Greek knowledge. Philosophy, ethics, logic, rhetoric, and poetry formed its core. Around this grew the sciences of history, geography, biology, mathematics, and astronomy. The aim was not simply to teach facts, but to weave a mind capable of perceiving patterns, discerning laws, seeing connections. For Aristotle believed that a ruler must not only master politics and war, but also grasp the eternal questions of good and evil, justice and destiny. At the heart of it all stood rhetoric. To rule men, one must master words. Aristotle trained Alexander in the art of speech, how to construct an argument, how to select the fitting phrase, how to sway an audience's mind, how to kindle passion or calm it. Together they studied the works of great orators, dissected myths, recited verses, analysed the power of poetry. They spoke of the tongue as a weapon and as a balm, as a tool of command and of persuasion. But Aristotle never abandoned his devotion to the natural world. He took the prince to fields and rivers, to woods and hills. They examined plants and animals, traced the rhythm of the seasons, looked upward at the heavens. These lessons were not abstract. They were demonstrations that the world itself was a system, a whole bound together by hidden threads. And to govern men, Alexander must first understand the order of nature itself. Their dialogues reached beyond astronomy and zoology. They turned to politics, the structure of the state, the necessity of law, the meaning of justice. For Aristotle believed that power without justice was only tyranny, and law without wisdom was only shadow. And so, under the branches of Miesa, philosophy and kingship grew side by side. Aristotle impressed upon the young prince that power was never only strength. True rule, he taught, was responsibility. Together they examined the forms of government, monarchy, democracy, tyranny. They weighed their virtues and their failings, traced the causes of prosperity and of decay. He urged Alexander to see that no state could endure without just law, without a balance of interests, without an understanding of the nature of society itself. It is said that Aristotle prepared a private library for his pupil, a selection of works he deemed essential for any ruler. Among them were the poems of Homer, especially the Iliad. For Alexander, this was no mere text. It became a sacred companion. Legends tell that he slept with it beneath his pillow, beside his sword, carrying it into every campaign. Aristotle himself may have annotated a special copy, guiding the prince to read Homer not only as poetry, but as a manual for life, a mirror for the choices of power and honour. Yet their relationship was never simple. Alexander was too proud, too independent to receive any teaching without question. He argued, he demanded explanations, he pushed back even against his master. Far from silencing him, Aristotle welcomed it. For the philosopher knew that truth is not planted by command but awakened by dialogue. These conversations, half lesson, half contest, formed the foundation of Alexander's intellect. For 3 years the education continued, until the boy became 16. At that time Philip departed once more on campaign, leaving Alexander as regent of Macedonia. In this appointment lay both risk and recognition. The student was entrusted with the state. He had stepped across a threshold, no longer only a learner but a statesman. For Aristotle, this was a sign. His primary mission had been fulfilled. Yet their bond did not dissolve. Years later, when Alexander marched eastward at the head of his armies, he instructed his generals and officials to gather for Aristotle what they found: strange animals and plants, minerals unknown in Greece, customs and laws of foreign peoples. From this stream of reports, Aristotle assembled the raw material for works that would outlast empires. The years at Philip's court were not merely an interlude. They granted Aristotle access to libraries, resources, the ears of statesmen. They gave him a stature that reached across the Greek world, and they sharpened in him a conviction that there must be a school of his own, a place where knowledge would not only be transmitted but shaped, arranged, cultivated, where it could grow. As Alexander prepared for conquest and Macedonia braced for transformation, Aristotle knew his time in Pella had come to its close. The time had come to return to Athens. The city that had once been his school would now become the stage for his boldest vision, to create a place where philosophy and science would walk together, bound not by abstraction alone but by the living pulse of the world. He returned not as Plato's pupil, nor as a wandering philosopher, but as a figure transformed, an educator of kings, a scientist of renown, a thinker of unshaken authority. Behind him lay decades of work, nearly 20 years in the academy, the years of research on the Aegean coasts, the service at Philip's court, the shaping of Alexander, the youth destined to alter the face of the known world. He came back with purpose clear in his mind, to found a school where knowledge would be structured, cultivated, and made whole. Athens itself had changed. Outwardly it remained free, yet the weight of Macedonia pressed heavily upon it. Some citizens seethed in quiet anger, others resigned themselves to the new reality. But despite politics, the life of the intellect had not dimmed. In its streets and colonnades, men still argued, taught, composed, and dreamed. Aristotle did not return to the academy. His path had diverged too far from Plato's. He no longer believed that truth resided in a separate, invisible realm of ideas. For him, truth was here, in the breath of animals, in the growth of plants, in the order of the cosmos itself. His method was different: to observe, to collect, to compare, to reason from experience. What he needed was not merely a circle for debate, but an institution that united theory with practice, a sanctuary of inquiry, a true scientific centre. He found it near the temple of Apollo Lysius. There stood a gymnasium surrounded by gardens and shaded colonnades, with broad paths ideal for long walks. It was here that he established his school, and from its setting it took its name, the Lyceum. Its pupils would be called the Peripatetics, those who walk about, for their teacher often guided them in thought while moving slowly beneath the trees. From its first days the Lyceum bore a different spirit than the academy, where Plato's halls resounded with dialogue about eternal forms and perfect states. Aristotle's Lyceum was a workshop of the real. Here, knowledge was not built only on dialectic, but on observation. The earth, the sky, the body, the city, all were subjects worthy of study. Truth, he taught, is hidden within the things themselves. To seek it was not to turn away from the world, but to look more closely into its vast diversity. And so, the Lyceum began, not as a place of dreams alone, but as a laboratory of reality. The rhythm of life in the Lyceum was carefully arranged as precise as the turning of the heavens. At dawn, before the city awoke, the inner circle gathered. These were the achromatic lectures, teachings reserved for the closest students, demanding the sharpest minds. Here Aristotle unfolded his most intricate courses: metaphysics, logic, physics, ethics, psychology, politics, rhetoric, poetics. Together they probe the deepest questions. What is the essence of being? What are the true causes of change? How does the soul think, feel, and know? By what laws do states rise, endure, and collapse? What role does virtue play in the fragile span of a human life? By midday, the doors opened wider. In shaded courtyards and long colonnades, Exoteric lectures drew merchants, travellers, craftsmen, and ambitious youths preparing for public life. These sessions dealt with the practical, rhetoric and oratory, political constitutions, histories of nations, studies of geography, reflections on literature and methods of education. To many, this was their first encounter with philosophy, not as distant speculation but as guidance for living and governing. Yet the Lyceum was more than a school. It was an engine of research. Aristotle did not imagine knowledge as something finished to be handed down. He saw it as something alive, always growing. He sent his pupils across Greece, to the islands of the Aegean, through Asia Minor, even to Egypt. They returned with notes, drawings, objects, accounts of laws, customs, animals, plants, minerals, climates. Everything was gathered, catalogued and examined, piece by piece, until a picture of the world began to emerge. One of his greatest achievements was the library he assembled, not a casual collection, but one of the earliest scientific libraries in history. Scrolls were organised by theme, catalogued with indices and annotations. Aristotle himself drew up lists, grouped works by subject, and added commentary. Soon, it became the largest treasury of knowledge in all of Hellas, a repository where memory and method met. But the Lyceum was not only a library, it was the first laboratory. Here, students dissected animals, traced the growth of embryos, observed the habits of insects, fish and birds. They described plants and minerals, noted the shifting of seasons, the patterns of weather. For Aristotle, to understand nature, one had to look at nature, patiently, with care and with respect. And unlike the solitary reflection that dominated Plato's academy, here research was collective. One student recorded the anatomy of animals, another documented the forms of plants, another compared political systems of cities and kingdoms. Their labour was divided, yet united in purpose. It was a new vision of knowledge, philosophy no longer locked in a thinker's mind, but woven into a community, drawn from the living world and returned to it in order. All the findings of his students flowed back to Aristotle, who wove them into a grand tapestry of thought. Nothing was too small, no observation too trivial. Each fact was a thread, and together they formed the fabric of a world that could be seen, named, and understood. His days were divided with monastic precision. Mornings began with lectures for his closest pupils. Afternoons were spent in gatherings of research groups, comparing observations and refining their notes. Evenings brought the exoteric lectures, open to wider audiences, and when the city had quieted, when torches burned low, he bent once more over his own writings. In his rare moments of rest, if they could be called rest, he sat with his students, questioning them closely, adjusting their terms, refining their arguments, correcting their reports. The Lyceum, for him, was never only a school. It was not even only a scientific centre. It was the living embodiment of a principle. Knowledge was not the hoarding of truths, but a ceaseless labour of mind, where observation joined analysis, where experience fed reflection, where the abstract and the concrete met. For the first time in history, philosophy and the natural sciences were not treated as separate domains. Logic was paired with empirical data, metaphysics with real facts, ethics with the actual life of societies. This union of theory and practice, reason and observation, became the foundation not only of Hellenistic science, but of the entire Western intellectual tradition. Here, in the Lyceum, the first model of the university was born, a space where thought was free, where knowledge was tested against experience, where every answer opened into another question. When the Lyceum began to work at full strength, Aristotle devoted himself entirely to what he considered his highest calling, the creation of a systematic, comprehensive vision of the world, one that would encompass every field of knowledge open to man. It was more than a school, more than philosophy. He was building the first encyclopedia of human science, a vast synthesis of data on nature, society, language, culture, government, and the human being. At the core of this immense labour lay a conviction. Truth must rest not only on reasoning but on experience, on close observation, on careful study of reality itself. Knowledge, he believed, must be organised, must reveal causes, structures, and the laws that govern phenomena. Unlike Plato, who clothed his ideas in polished dialogues, Aristotle wrote in the plain form of science itself. His works were notes of lectures, outlines for teaching, internal drafts for the school. His style was stripped of ornament, dry, dense with definitions, lists, classifications, logical schemes, not literary but precise, not decorative but exacting. He sought not to dazzle, but to endure. At the foundation of Aristotle's vast intellectual edifice lay a discipline that he himself forged: logic. Before him, no formal science of thought existed. Men reasoned, argued, persuaded, but none had yet set down the laws of correct reasoning, the structures by which truth could be reliably pursued. Aristotle was the first to map that unseen terrain. He described the architecture of deductive reasoning, giving form to the syllogism, a structure in which a conclusion follows with necessity from two premises. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. With this clarity, the fog of rhetoric parted, revealing reasoning as a tool as sharp and dependable as any blade. His works on logic were gathered under a single title: the organon, the instrument. For Aristotle, logic was not an end in itself, but a tool of thought, indispensable to every other science. Within this cycle of texts he laid out an extraordinary system. In categories, he dissected the basic forms of being and the statements we make about it. On interpretation, he studied the structure of propositions. In the prior analytics, he unfolded the full theory of syllogisms. The posterior analytics advanced the notion of scientific proof. Topics explored the methods of dialectical reasoning, while on sophistical refutations exposed the false arguments of sophists and taught how to unmask illusion with rigour. But Aristotle's curiosity never stopped at the threshold of thought alone. For him, physis, nature, was a realm of endless inquiry. His physics was not the narrow discipline the word later came to mean, but a vast investigation of change, movement, space, time, the causes of birth and destruction, the very structure of the natural world. It was here that he gave its classic form to his theory of four causes: the material cause, what a thing is made of; the formal cause, what makes a thing what it is; the efficient cause, that which brings it into being or sets it in motion; the final cause, the purpose for which it exists. With this framework, he offered not just explanation, but a vision of reality as ordered and intelligible. Among his writings, none shone more brightly than his studies of living creatures. Aristotle became, in a sense, the first biologist. He described more than 500 species of animals with meticulous attention. So precise were his observations that many remained unsurpassed until the dawn of modern science. In works such as History of Animals, On the Parts of Animals, On the Movement of Animals, and On the Generation of Animals, he attempted what no one had done before: to classify the living world. He divided animals according to the presence or absence of blood, a distinction that, in modern terms, roughly aligns with vertebrates and invertebrates. He traced their forms, their organs, their behaviours, their adaptations to environment. With extraordinary patience, he observed the stages of embryonic development, the first threads of blood vessels in the yolk, the gradual shaping of organs, the passage from the undefined to the defined, from the simple to the complex. For him, life revealed itself as a process of becoming, an unfolding order. Step by step, nature itself was teaching him its law, that growth is movement toward form. But Aristotle's gaze did not rest solely on the body or the cosmos. He turned as well to the hidden depths of the soul. In his treatise On the Soul, he proposed that the soul was not some separate substance drifting apart from the body, but rather its form, the principle that makes a living thing alive. It was the pattern that animates flesh, the spark that gives order to matter. He distinguished 3 levels of soul: the vegetative soul, present in plants, animals and humans alike, governed growth, nourishment and reproduction. The sensitive soul, found in animals and humans, enabled perception, sensation and movement, and the rational soul, unique to humanity, was the power to think, to reflect, to know. With this framework, the hierarchy of life became not chaos but structure, each level building upon the one before. Beyond psychology, he devoted immense labour to the study of society. His treatise Politics did not rest on imagined utopias or abstract ideals, but on the examination of actual constitutions. Together with his students, he gathered data on more than 100 city-states, analysing their laws, their strengths, their fragilities. Only the Athenian constitution survives to our day. But the original collection was vast, a mirror of governance across the Greek world. Through it, Aristotle sought to uncover why some states endure while others collapse. In rhetoric, he forged the first systematic guide to persuasion, dissecting the anatomy of speech. He identified its 3 essential elements: logos, the logic and reason of argument; pathos, the power to stir emotion; and ethos, the credibility and authority of the speaker himself. Together, these forces made language into a weapon, a bridge, a bond. In poetics, he became the first theorist of art. He studied tragedy, introducing terms that still live: catharsis, the purification of pity and fear; peripeteia, the sudden reversal of fortune; and anagnorisis, the moment of recognition when hidden truth is revealed. He explained how the weaving of plot, the shaping of character, and the choices of heroes work upon the audience's heart. For Aristotle, drama was not mere entertainment, but a mirror of human life, a path to wisdom through feeling. His method bound together 2 movements of mind, induction and deduction. He began with careful observation of countless facts, drew from them general principles, then tested those principles against fresh cases. For the first time in history, the movement from particular to general, inductive reasoning, was made explicit, and he built a great architecture of knowledge itself. He classified the sciences into 3 branches: theoretical sciences, physics, metaphysics, mathematics, whose aim was truth; practical sciences, ethics, politics, concerned with right action; and productive sciences, poetics, rhetoric, the arts, whose aim was creation. Each discipline had its own subject, its own method, its own goal. In this way, Aristotle's system embraced the whole of existence, from the organs of a mollusk to the structure of the cosmos, from the laws of motion to the laws of cities. He was the first in history to attempt what no mind before him had dared, to offer a complete, logically ordered account of reality in all its diversity. His intellectual encyclopedia was a cathedral of knowledge, built stone by stone through relentless work. This was not the labour of one man alone. Around him the entire community of the Lyceum contributed. Students gathered facts, described animals and plants, recorded customs and laws, classified observations. Together they erected a structure of thought that had no equal in the ancient world. But even as this great work advanced, the world around him shifted. In 323 BCE, news spread that shook the entire Hellenic world. Alexander the Great was dead. In Babylon, far from his homeland, the conqueror of continents, the youth who had crossed from Greece to India, was suddenly gone. His death cracked the fragile unity of the empire he had forged. Provinces revolted, cities rose in defiance, wars of succession erupted. Greece itself stirred with the hope of reclaiming lost independence. In Athens the air grew thick with unrest. Public assemblies resounded with anger, demanding that all who bore ties to Macedonia be cast out. Suspicion fell swiftly upon philosophers, scholars, and every figure who had been connected with the Macedonian court. At the centre of this storm stood Aristotle. His link was undeniable. Tutor of Alexander, founder of a school long supported by Macedonian patronage. Though he had never sought political office, never ruled nor commanded armies, his name became a target. The charges came in a form as old as the city itself: impiety, the insult of the gods. It was the same accusation that 80 years earlier had condemned Socrates to drink the hemlock. And now, in an Athens clouded by fear and fury, such an accusation was perilous beyond measure. Aristotle understood immediately the danger. To remain was to risk the fate of his master's master. He is said to have remarked with bitter clarity, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin against philosophy a second time." He chose exile, quietly, without speeches or pleas, without standing before the assembly, he departed. His path led to Chalcis, his mother's birthplace, a city where family ties remained, where property and a house awaited him. He left Athens behind, not in defeat, but in silence, carrying with him the weight of a world he had tried to explain. In Chalcis, far from the storms that shook mainland Greece, Aristotle sought to pass his remaining years. His house stood near the sea, embraced by olive groves and quiet gardens. The city felt the tremors of war, but not with the fever that consumed Athens. Here, in relative calm, the philosopher resumed his teaching. Students from the Lyceum travelled to him, carrying scrolls, drafts, fragments of notes. Together they discussed the hardest questions of metaphysics, logic, natural science, politics, and ethics. If anything, the work grew heavier. It became sharper, more urgent, as though Aristotle sensed that time was narrowing around him. He hurried to refine, to complete, to order what was still unfinished. His health was failing. Sources disagree on the cause. Some say he suffered from a chronic illness of the stomach that had plagued him since youth. Others suggest the strain of exile, the burden of grief, and the weight of overwork hastened the decline. Whatever the truth, at 62, an age already venerable in antiquity, his body weakened, but his mind did not rest. Almost to the very end he laboured. He dictated corrections to his students, revised earlier notes, brought together materials that had been gathered for decades, descriptions of animals, observations of stars, texts on poetics, rhetoric, politics, physics, metaphysics, and logic. Knowledge gathered over a lifetime, now arranged so it might outlive him, and yet, as his strength waned, he spent more hours in solitude. He sat in the garden, under the shade of trees, watching clouds drift, birds wheel, wind stir the branches. The same sights that had first awakened his thought in childhood now accompanied him at the close of his life. Nature, which had been his first teacher, became his last companion. One of his final requests was simple. He wished to be buried beside his wife, Pythias, who had died before him. He left precise instructions regarding his funeral, his household, and above all the future of the Lyceum. The school, he insisted, must endure beyond him. Its care he entrusted to Theophrastus, his closest friend and pupil, already renowned as a botanist and philosopher in his own right. In 322 BCE, Aristotle died. His passing marked not only the end of a life, but the twilight of an age. That same year, Athens hurled itself into the Lamian War, its final attempt to throw off Macedonian rule. The war ended in defeat. Athens lost its independence forever, and with the fall of the city and the death of the philosopher, a chapter of Greek spirit closed. Aristotle himself would never know what came after. Of his final days little is recorded. No mention of grand ceremonies, no public honours, no solemn procession. Only a quiet burial in Chalcis, on family ground beside his wife, just as he had wished. Thus ended the life of the man who, perhaps more than any other in human history, sought to gather the world into a single vision. The man who laid the foundations of sciences, methods, and concepts that would guide thought for millennia. When his ashes were given to the earth, few could have imagined what would follow. His writings did not die with him. They would outlive the fall of the Greek city-states, the collapse of Alexander's empire, the ruin of Rome, and even the long shadows of the early Middle Ages. They would rise again in the lecture halls of European universities, ignite the engines of scientific revolution, and remain alive to this very day. At once, his legacy found a guardian. His closest friend and disciple, Theophrastus, took up the Lyceum. He preserved the library, the archives, the unfinished manuscripts, the fragile tradition of the school. More than a caretaker, he became a scholar in his own right, a botanist and naturalist of renown. Under his guidance, the Lyceum did not wither, it flourished. For nearly 2 more centuries it remained one of the great centres of learning, a beacon of philosophy and science. In the Hellenistic age, the focus of scholarship shifted eastward. Athens gave way to Alexandria, Rhodes, and the cities of the eastern Mediterranean. In the vast halls of the Library of Alexandria, Aristotle's works were copied, studied, and debated. Scholars of that era laboured not only to preserve what he had written, but to digest it, to systematise it, to extend it into their own inquiries. Later antiquity greeted his thought with mixed voices. Neoplatonists, Stoics, and Skeptics argued with him, reshaped his ideas, rejected some, accepted others. Yet in logic, biology, rhetoric, and political theory, his writing still commanded respect, still served as touchstones for generations. Then came the decline of Rome, and with it the dimming of knowledge in the West. As the early Middle Ages unfolded, much of Aristotle's work seemed lost to time. Yet knowledge has its own tides, and what sinks in one sea often rises in another. For centuries the Latin West knew Aristotle only as the master of logic. His categories, on interpretation, and topics remained in circulation. But his greater body of work, physics, metaphysics, biology, psychology, politics, rhetoric, lay forgotten, inaccessible, silent. In the East, however, his tradition endured. In Byzantium, and even more so in the Arab world, Aristotle's thought not only survived, it flourished. Between the 6th and 10th centuries, Muslim scholars translated his writings from Greek into Arabic. They commented on them, debated him, expanded his ideas, and enriched them with discoveries of their own. In Baghdad, Cordoba, Damascus, and Cairo, his legacy was reborn. It was through this Arabic bridge that Aristotle returned to Europe. By the 10th century, great efforts began to translate both Greek and Arabic texts into Latin. Slowly, the forgotten voice of the philosopher re-entered the West. By the 11th and 12th centuries, his works once more became the foundation of European learning. Universities that were rising in Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Florence, and beyond built much of their curriculum upon his system. Logic, metaphysics, ethics, and politics of Aristotle became the pillars of medieval education. His influence was not only intellectual, but spiritual. Thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas wove Aristotelian philosophy into Christian theology, creating a vast synthesis of faith and reason. His notions of form and matter, of causality and purpose, became instruments to explain not only nature, but also divine order. For centuries, Aristotelian physics reigned as the official worldview of the universities. It shaped the teaching of Europe until the 15th and 16th centuries, when Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton broke open a new vision of the cosmos. Yet what is striking is that even when his models were overturned, his method endured. His insistence on causes, on classification, on observation, and above all on moving from particular facts to general laws, this became the very heart of modern science. The Renaissance rediscovered him with fresh eyes. Leonardo da Vinci sketched dissections and machines in the same spirit of inquiry. Copernicus challenged his astronomy but continued his search for order. Newton overturned his physics, yet still built upon the inductive path Aristotle had first cleared. They opposed him, but they also followed him. And so, while the details of his cosmos were replaced, the architecture of his method remained, the scaffolding upon which modern science rose. In the 19th century, a new wave of attention returned to Aristotle, not only as a philosopher, but as the first true historian of science, the great systematizer of human knowledge. From then to now, his legacy has remained inseparable from global intellectual culture. Today, his works are taught in every university across the world. His treatises on logic still form the starting point for the study of formal systems, philosophy of language, and mathematics. His approach to biological classification became the foundation of modern taxonomy. His poetics and politics remain alive in debate. From bioethics to artificial intelligence, from legal philosophy to political theory, his reflections on causes, on purpose, on form and matter continue to shape discussions in philosophy of science, bioinformatics, and cognitive studies. His vision of the golden mean, the balance between extremes, still underpins many modern ethical systems. Yet perhaps his greatest inheritance is not any single body of knowledge, nor a set of categories or classifications. It is something deeper, his attitude toward reality itself, his conviction that the world is intelligible, that it can be studied, that it follows rational patterns, his faith that truth is revealed to those who observe carefully, reason precisely, and above all ask the right questions. The name of Aristotle has become a symbol of the human desire to understand the world in its entirety. in all its complexity, in all its expressions, in all its infinite diversity. His legacy is not a closed book, but an invitation, not an end, but a path. It is a call to the endless search for truth, to the ceaseless striving for understanding, a striving that never concludes, but always becomes the next step on the journey toward greater knowledge, like the boy in Stagira watching the sea, like the teacher walking beneath the colonnades of the Lyceum, like the old man in Chalcis gazing at the wind in the trees. His voice whispers still, "The world can be known. Truth waits in the open. Ask and begin again."